Hello, Tony Jones live from the Gold Coast. Tonight on Q&A, Willox, Larissa Waters, Simon Birmingham, Chris Bowen and Miranda Stewart. Well, it's a taxing time for the biggest banks, but as the Liberal Party shifts left, are the days of small government over? We'll be back in a minute with Q&A.
Tomorrow, from the farm gate to the family plate.
We're buying too much and we're throwing it away.
Have we been conditioned to only eat perfect-looking produce?
We got this. This was going in the bin. It's crazy.
What a waste.
Who is to blame for all the waste?
Their standards, they tell us, are our standards.
And how can you make a difference?
So now the revolution is in your hands.
The War on Waste starts tomorrow, 8:30. And take the War on Waste survey to find out more. Organised crime, gambling and corruption.
Someone on your team is part of this syndicate. Who is it?
A global web that hits where it hurts most.
The witness. He's my father. Your father?
Janet King, Thursday, May 25.
Tonight, ahead of the latest Syria peace talks in Geneva, we travel to the border with Turkey to hear from civilians fleeing the last rebel stronghold of Idlib. And former president of the Syrian National Council, Hadi al-Bahra, joins us from Istanbul. That's Lateline, right after Q&A.
Good evening and welcome to Q&A. We're live from the Gold Coast Arts Centre. I'm Tony Jones. Joining me to answer your questions in the first Q&A since the budget, the Chief Executive of the Australian Industry Group, Willox. Greens Co-Deputy, Larissa Waters. Education Minister, Simon Birmingham. Shadow Treasurer, Chris Bowen. And the Director of the ANU's Tax Policy Unit, Miranda Stewart. Please welcome our panel. Thank you. Now, Q&A is live on ABC TV in Eastern Australia. It's live everywhere else on the ABC News channel at 9:35 Eastern Standard Time. You can watch and listen live on iView, YouTube, Facebook, ABC News Radio and Periscope. Now, before we start, we'd like to pay tribute to our dear friend and colleague, Mark Colvin, who died last Thursday. For more than 40 years, Mark held politicians and leaders around the world to account with fearless journalism and tough questions. Well, that's our objective here at Q&A. We want to dedicate tonight's program edition to Mark Colvin and the standards he set for us. Well, our first question comes from Oliver Barani.
My question for the entire panel. The hallmark of any coalition government is a small government with lower taxes. The Howard government delivered surplus after surplus. The Abbott government came in saying that the age of entitlement is over and that we all must live within our means. But the Turnbull government seemed to be saying that big government can be good. Indeed, many believe that this budget is a Labor-light budget. Is this budget recognition that we need a bigger government that taxes more and spends more?
Simon Birmingham, a philosophical question for you.
It is a big one to kick off with. And Oliver, whilst I think efficient governments and governments that try to reduce so far as possible the level of taxes are a hallmark of coalition governments, I'd equally also say that investment in supporting Australians who need it, in delivering the services that are so essential to Australians, are also hallmarks that have been part of coalition governments, Liberal and national governments, right since Menzies' era, a sense of pragmatic politics that recognises that, yes, we want to keep taxes as low as we can to generate investment across our economy. And in this budget, we're still committed to important things that aren't necessarily universally popular, but are important to increase the competitiveness of Australia, such as our enterprise tax reform plans. They're still locked in there, and Labor's position around those is uncertain. We equally in this budget have delivered a clear pathway to get the budget back into balance, and that balance is achieved by 2020-2021.
Okay, now you're giving us the kind of stump speech on the budget, but he wants to know whether you've shifted to the left, and that's what Peter Credlin has said, that you've gone from a centre-right government to a centre-left government.
I think, Tony, I started out very clearly.
That now believes in big government.
Yeah, and I think I started out very clearly addressing Oliver's issue that we have always believed that support for Australians who need it in terms of the pension system, in terms of a strong social safety net, in terms of support for healthcare and services, in terms of investment in education, are all core things. And in this budget, as we've been saying for a number of years, we wanted to see the NDIS, the National Disability Insurance Scheme, delivered in full and funded in full. And in this budget, we've had to take some difficult decisions to do that, but without compromising on ensuring that we bring the budget back to balance, which is one of the other core Liberal principles, and that's exactly what we've achieved.
But are you worried that Conservative Liberals are going to jump ship because already this evening the same Peter Credlin, former Chief of Staff to your former leader, is actually saying the era of the Turnbull experiment is over, there needs to be a leadership change?
Well, look, there will always be commentators coming from fringes of all directions. This budget and the direction and decisions of the Turnbull government are about trying to make sure that we balance all of the competing interests and services that we must do for Australia. How do we keep a strong economy? How do we bring the budget back to balance? How do we pay for the NDIS? How do we deliver the investment in schools and healthcare and pensions and a strong social safety net that Australians want? Australians want all of those things, and this is a budget that seeks to try to do them all and do them all in a responsible and effective way.
Okay. Chris Bowen, this is a Labor-light government. That was the Labor-light budget, I should say.
No. The Treasurer and the government told us that Australia didn't have a revenue problem. And then in the budget, they've increased tax by $20 billion. Well, I'd hate to see what they did if they thought Australia did have a revenue problem. But on the matter of Labor light, it's clear that they're trying to catch up with us. We've set the agenda on health, on education, on housing affordability, but they're falling short. They're falling short.
They've stolen quite a few of your policies.
Well, not really. I mean, they've recognised that they've needed to fix these issues, but they're not fixing them properly, whether it's health or education or housing affordability. The policy offering is just falling short on every occasion. Now, to go to the nub of your point, though, it is the case that the government lacks a core economic belief system and narrative. I mean, just in the last few years, we've been through age of entitlement, which I think you referred to, jobs and growth, lifters and leaners, have a go, and now we've got better times. I mean, the strategy changes, mainly because of an attempt, in this case, to try and get a positive opinion poll to stave off those 30 negative opinion polls which Malcolm Turnbull set that test.
Do you suspect you may be facing someone different at the next election?
Yes. Yes, I do. I do not believe that Malcolm Turnbull will be leader of the Liberal Party at the next election. I do not.
Larissa Waters.
Look, that's a good question, Oliver, and I think it's really clear that this isn't a Greens light budget because if you've looked closely at the figures, there's almost nothing in there for the environment for a start, except of course there's $60 million for fracking. There's virtually nothing in there that tackles climate change, which should be a challenge that we're all attending to.
Okay, sorry, we can't be clapping every statement. That's just not going to work.
Thank you, though. Thank you. And what little money it does raise is often raised off the back of those that can least afford to pay, attacking people who are seeking work. So whilst the budget has some positive features, including the bank levy, which we Greens have long advocated for, and revenue raising off those most profitable banks who've not had some great conduct in the past when it comes to consumers, we think that's a good idea. There's still things like $24 billion in handouts for big mining companies with cheap fuel and accelerated depreciation. And there's still $65 billion of corporate tax cuts. So I don't think the government has strayed too far from its ideological position to favour the big end of town and to crack down on people who actually need our support.
Okay, Ines Willox, we're going to try and get through a lot of questions tonight, so I'm just reminding our panellists.
I'll learn my lessons. Look, there's no doubt, Oliver, that it is, and it does represent a change in direction. It represents ending the measures from the 2014 budget and striking out in a new direction. And there was, from a business perspective, from membership of my organisation, the Australian Industry Group, there was a lot to like, and there were some questionable parts of it too. The accelerated depreciation measures for smaller businesses and the extension of that was very welcome. That was a very welcome measure. The emphasis on skills, on infrastructure, on small business, all of that was welcome. But it is a budget where there are some quite significant tax increases, the Medicare levy and the like. But at the same time, the government has committed itself to corporate tax cuts, and we'll no doubt talk about that as the evening goes on. But also since then, the Treasurer has flagged personal tax cuts perhaps coming. And for business, for our members, the first area of priority for the budget to get the country moving properly was corporate tax reform, and that's quite broad, tax reform more broadly. And the third most important issue was personal income tax cuts to get people spending again. So look, there's no doubt it does signal a change in direction quite deliberately. There's been a lot of commentary about a shift to the left, but it's certainly a change in tone and direction of the country. And I think as a whole, we're all still absorbing it.
Miranda, Stewart, what you said is a philosophical shift.
Look, I think the people made clear that they did want public spending on health and education and so on, so it is good to see the budget do that. And to shift to the revenue side, I might point out that the Liberal governments have raised substantial revenue in the past, though focusing on taxes is not an entirely philosophical shift. Liberal governments, including Menzies, have also run deficits in the past. And one of the challenges that I think both Labor and Liberal parties have had in the last few years has been that the decade of the 2000s under Costello potentially created a structural deficit as a result of personal tax cuts at that time, which have taken a long time to feed through. So we do need more revenue, and it is good. It's very pragmatic in the way it's gone about it, but it is good to see a bit more revenue in the budget.
Okay, let's move on. We've got quite a lot of questions to get through, as I mentioned. This one's from Sam Van Berkel.
My question's for the Shadow Treasurer. Last week, former Prime Minister Paul Keating came out in opposition to your tax plan to institute a top rate of 49.5%, saying this was far too punitive and that 39% would be more appropriate. Do you agree with Paul Keating in this regard, or do you think that over a certain level the state should be confiscating almost half of a person's income?
Well, to be clear, what we're talking about is a marginal rate, so the income above 180,000. So for somebody on, say, 190,000, the average taxpayer is about 31%. So it's not confiscating half of the income. Yes, over that level, but they're paying an overall tax rate. Now, this isn't a decision taken easily or lightly by us. There are lots of difficult decisions necessary. We do want to see the budget get back to balance. At the same time, we want to invest in education in particular. Invest in making sure that every Australian child can grow to their full potential. We think that's an important economic reform. Now, we think that's a fairer way of doing it. You know, last year, every Australian earning more than $80,000 got a tax cut. The government's position is that on July 1st, every Australian earning more than $180,000 should get a tax cut. Now, if the budget's under such pressure, we say if you're going to have tax rises now, and the Treasurer has claimed his big legacy was going to have personal tax cuts. In fact, this is a big personal tax rise, but they want it to apply from $21,000 onwards. Now, people on $21,000 onwards aren't in a position to be paying more tax, in our view, with wages growth at record lows.
Now, we'll come to that specifically.
Sure.
There are questions on that subject.
No, but
he mentioned Paul Keating there, and Paul Keating's basic point is that if you tax people too much, you're going to blunt the animal spirits of capitalism.
Paul's point is,
aren't you worried about that?
All right.
Paul's point is that both sides of politics should be looking to try and get that top marginal tax rate down. I've discussed this with him at length. It's a long-held view that he's had. And when we're in balance, you can review the tax rates and you can provide some tax relief. But my point is that it's been a long time since low-income earners got a tax cut in Australia. You'd have to go back to the Gillard government. I'm not saying that people on $80,000 are high-income earners, but all of those of us who are on more than $80,000 got a tax cut last year. And so if there's now a tax rise in the mix, which there is, then we've got to look at targeting that properly. And yes, from our point of view, that means not proceeding with the deficit levy coming off, which is a tax cut. You know, if you're on more than $180,000, you'll pay less tax on the 2nd of July than you did on the 30th of June this year. That's a tax cut at the same time as the government's increasing the tax for everybody else. And that's just, in our view, that is just not fair. And that leads to a difficult decision to increase the top marginal tax rate, because we think that is the fairest way of doing it.
Okay, Simon Birmingham, and then I'll go to Larissa.
Well, unsurprisingly, I think Paul Keating is broadly right to criticise the Labor Party there. Of course, it's not the first time we've seen Paul Keating's views at odds with modern Labor in
got pretty
terms
strong
of the
views on your
scale
side as
of
well.
taxing and spending and otherwise that we see coming from Labor. And it's absolutely, no doubt that Paul Keating, as Treasurer, championed lower company tax rates as a way to make Australia more competitive, something that remains part of the Coalition's policy and that we've partly delivered, and Chris is unable to say whether Labor would unwind the bits that we have now delivered for companies earning less than $50 million or not. So that's an issue for Chris and the Labor Party to address coming up to the next election, but we know that we're there in terms of making small and medium-sized businesses in Australia more competitive, that we want to ensure in terms of income tax rates that they are as competitive as the nation can afford. Yes, we want to fully fund the NDIS, and in 2 years' time, when it's necessary to deliver additional funding into the NDIS, that's when our measures around the 0.5% increase in the Medicare levy apply. But that's a 0.5% increase in the Medicare levy.
Okay, now you're starting to anticipate questions we're about to go to, and very briefly, I want
Just trying to save time, Tony.
I am trying to save time because we're going to go to that question in a moment. Larissa.
Sam, just quickly on keeping the deficit levy permanent, that's what we Greens moved for in 2014, and sadly we didn't get any support from either of the big parties at that time, so we certainly welcome that Labor have changed their mind on that one. We think that is a fair tax that should be kept. But what was disheartening to see in the last few weeks was a ruling out of the Buffett tax, which would ensure that the highest income earners, so the top 1% of income earners in Australia, couldn't wheedle their way through tricky accounting out of paying less than 35% of their income. It's that kind of honesty in accounting that I think would raise, well, the figures would show it would go a long way towards raising the money to fund the NDIS, and it would mean, of course, that the government wouldn't have to attack people on low and middle incomes to fund what is a worthy policy that should be funded.
Okay, Ines, just a brief one. Should wealthy people pay more tax?
Well, Sam, it's a good question. Look, we just need to keep in mind that we have one of the highest progressive tax rates in the developed world at the moment, and you think of the new chief executive of Hong Kong. I'm not trying to do a direct comparison with us with Hong Kong, but the case is the same. She comes in, there's a tax rate there of 18%, and she says her first priority is to get that tax rate down. And we're having an argument here about whether to have a top tax rate of 49%. We have to look at how do we remain competitive, how do we attract people to this country, and we would run the risk, I fear, with the top tax rate of 49%, however it is configured, of it being a disincentive for talented people to stay here, let alone to come here. And that's just something we just need to keep in mind.
Okay, let's move on. The next question. Thank you. Thank you very much. Good to see applause from both sides, but keep it down. The next question is from
Oh no,
Nikki.
I liked it. I liked
That's
it.
all right.
It's all right with you.
Nikki Popova-Clark.
So this budget has turned Australia into the reverse Robin Hood by removing the 2% budget deficit levy, stealing from the poor by increasing the Medicare levy and giving it to the rich. I would like to know how this is fair.
Simon Birmingham.
Nikki, the bulk of tax paid in Australia is paid by the highest income earners in Australia. That's the way our progressive income tax system works. It's the way it works now. It's the way it will continue to work. The bulk of a 0.5% increase in the Medicare levy to fully fund the National Disability Insurance Scheme will be paid for by the highest income earners in Australia. That's, of course, the way a 0.5% works, that somebody earning around $40,000 per annum will make about a $200 contribution towards their support under the NDIS, whereas somebody earning around $200,000 per annum will make a $1,000 contribution towards their protection under the NDIS. But the NDIS will protect all Australians in a universal way, even though those earning more will pay more to support the rest of the country. That's the nature of our tax system. We absolutely support the maintenance of a progressive tax system, but to the point that Ines made before, Australia also has to be a country that incentivises people to work harder, to earn that extra buck, to strive to actually do better, to create more jobs for people, to attract investment and people from overseas, and that they are the types of measures that also need to be kept in mind in terms of our competitiveness. And this, again, is a budget that seeks to strike that balance, to commit, to fully fund, to deliver something like the National Disability Insurance Scheme that is so vital to ensuring that safety net for Australians is there, but to fund it in a way that is fair and reasonable, that does see higher income earners paying more, but equally doesn't leave us in a situation where Australia becomes even less attractive or competitive.
Well, I think what the questioner was saying is it leaves everyone paying more above the income of 22,000. So it's a tax on everyone. And the earlier tax was a tax on high-income earners. She's asking, is that fair?
The very nature of a tax measure, like a 0.5% increase in a levy, means that people who earn more pay more.
Sure.
That's the nature of that type of tax arrangement. And the universality of the way the Medicare levy has always worked is that it's always applied to all Australians. People who earn more have paid greater dollars into supporting Medicare, and since it was extended to cover the NDIS, into supporting the NDIS. And that will continue in the future with this extra 0.5%. But I think we need to be very careful when we talk about the Medicare levy and universal programs of access like Medicare and like the NDIS to start saying only some Australians should actually make a contribution for those, only some Australians should pay. Of course, those who can afford should pay more, but that's exactly what our measure does.
Very quick one. Have you got the votes to get this through the Senate, this levy, the Medicare levy?
I've learned over 10 years in the Senate now, Tony, not to predict or preempt the Senate, but we'll work with the Senate. I hope that, frankly, everybody recognises it's in the best interests of Australia to give certainty around the NDIS, and this is a fair way to do it. When Labor proposed putting a 0.5% levy onto the Medicare levy to fund the NDIS, Bill Shorten derided anybody who might contemplate opposing it. Well, now he wants to oppose it or pick only bits of it and suggest somehow an alternative measure that would see around 7% of Australians pay about 80% of the additional costs for the NDIS. That's not...
Okay, well, let's let Labor explain that one. Chris Bell.
Well, I agree with the questioner. Thanks for the question. I agree with your point. Our model raises almost as much money as the government over the next 4 years and much more over the next 10 in a fairer way. But I want to go to Simon's now said, I think 4 times, this is to fund the NDIS. This is a very important point. And I want to say this very clearly. I welcome the fact that the Liberal Party now supports the NDIS. I really do.
We always have, Chris.
And I acknowledge that.
We always have.
I'm actually trying to pay a compliment.
Oh, well, it was a bit of a backhander with the words now.
No, it was a Labor initiative which you have continued. And I welcome that and I recognise that. That's very important for the nation.
Well,
but every time...
Well, hang on a sec. If you welcome it, the disability groups have come out today and said, don't play politics with this. And they've actually said, and some of the leaders of the disability groups have come out publicly today and said they back the government's method of doing this. They think it's fair that everyone should pay.
I want to say this very clearly. However, it is wrong for the government and for Simon to claim that the NDIS is not funded. It's wrong factually and it is wrong morally, because it makes people who rely on the NDIS care about or worry about whether the NDIS will continue. Now, the fact of the matter is the government signed the agreements. The NDIS will continue. It is funded. Now, Simon, I want to hear you justify how you can say the NDIS is not funded. I want to hear you explain that, because you can't say that there's a cost overrun. You can't say there's a cost overrun because your minister has already said that that's not the case. I want to hear you explain to these people and to me how you can argue the NDIS is not funded by Labor in office, because it was and is.
Well, Chris, the budget numbers speak pretty plainly for the period of time since you left office, and the fact that clearly additional spending commitments like the NDIS that came in the last year or so of your term in office clearly were not fully funded because the pressure on the budget is still there. Now, the growth in costs of the NDIS does grow by some billions of dollars over the next couple of years.
All fully funded, already fully
Chris,
funded.
It was absolutely not fully funded.
Well,
it was not fully funded, and indeed, of course, you have also made a real trend of voting against savings measures, including savings measures that you propose to fund things like the NDIS. Think about an efficiency dividend on universities.
Well, we'll get to that. I'm more than happy to debate that.
No, we're not going to debate that.
No, Chris, that was Labor Party policy before 2013.
Okay, Simon, I'm going to ask you to restrain yourself for a moment, because we're not in a free-for-all debate here. You can respond briefly, then we'll go to the next question, which, oddly enough, will bring to mind what's going on this table right now.
In office, Labor made a series of difficult decisions, of which the Medicare levy was just
whichever
one.
stacked up.
Which was the Medicare, and you deny they happened. They're in the budget, Simon. And the fact of the matter is that the NDIS themselves, the NDIA, have said that the costs match what we said they would in office, what the Productivity Commission said they would be in office. Your budget papers actually show you're spending less on the NDIS this year. There is no cost blowout, and it is just wrong for you to continue to say it. And for the sake of bipartisan support of the NDIS, you should stop and you should start telling the truth about the funding of the NDIS.
Okay, now remember, if you hear any doubtful claims on Q&A tonight, send a tweet using the hashtags FactCheck and Quanda. Keep an eye on our Twitter account, the Conversation website for fact checks by the experts. We may need a few there. Now, the next question, I should say, comes from Brett Doran, and it'll bring to mind the debate we've just been having.
Thanks. My question's for Chris and Simon. For almost a decade now, the Australian government's been producing a deficit and predicting a surplus within 4 years. Now, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing and expecting a different result. And it seems like we're doing exactly that right now. So my question to you, and I think it's very timely, so at what point will the major parties stop the negative politics, they're wrong and we're right, the scare campaigns, the short-term political views, and start working together on a constructive bipartisan approach to make real change so that we can live within our means?
Hang on. Please restrain yourself. You've got to finish this question.
And please stop promising some mystical land that will appear out of a hat in 4 years.
Okay. Now then, I'd like to start with our non-politicians, and I'll go to Miranda Stewart first.
Well, I want to come back to this question of whether something's funded or not, because actually a government budget is not like a household budget. There is always the possibility of raising revenue if that's what the people want, raising taxes to fund something. And it's also probably worth saying that the Medicare levy doesn't fund Medicare. Actually, Medicare costs more than that. It's funded out of consolidated revenue, all the taxes that you pay put together. So it's pretty misleading to kind of talk about funding or not funding particular programs. In terms of the question about the budget forecasts, I agree with the commentator there, the question there, that those forecasts do seem pretty unrealistic. We have seen that we're reliant not only on some rather heroic assumptions about wage growth over the next few years, but also the actual base numbers that are in the budget forecasting and then projection period seem again and again to be generating misleading outcomes.
So you don't think we're headed for a surplus in 4 years?
Look, it's probably a stupid thing to kind of go on what happened last year as well, but I agree with the suggestion that repeating the same thing again and again is a sign of insanity, and it doesn't seem obvious to me.
Okay, let's hear from Ines Willox, the other non-politician, and obviously representing business. Do you think that we are realistically heading for a surplus in the timescale, the end of this forward estimates period?
I hope so.
But looking at the type of budget we've had, you think so?
We've always taken the view that anything beyond 2 years in the forward estimates is really a bit of a stick your finger in the wind and hope for the best. Who knows what's going to happen in 3 or 4 years? Who knows what's going to happen to the global economy? I read the head of Bridgestone Capital, one of the world's biggest hedge funds today, saying he runs a $102 billion fund, that the downturn when it comes will be epic. Now, that's not looking good for our budget if that happens. So we don't know what's going to happen. But I've just got to say that the forecasts in this budget at least were, you could say, were more conservative than the Reserve Bank or the IMF's. They weren't out there off the chart silly. That said, it's a very slow grinding path. If we do get to a surplus in 2021, that'll be 15 years of deficits, of continuous deficits, and it was just going to be a temporary deficit back when it happened. But circumstances have changed, and that's the whole point around this budget. Circumstances in our economy change all the time. We would like to get to from a business perspective, an industry perspective, we would like to get to a surplus sooner rather than later, but it's got to be done in a productive way, not a slash and burn way. It's got to be done in a way where we are creating wealth, where we're creating infrastructure, where we're creating productivity, and we're driving growth. And that's got to be our ambition. I don't think we should be held hard and fast to a date, as long as we're trending in the right direction.
You're not just very briefly on this, you're not concerned that we're headed for a $600 billion plus debt?
That does concern me, that we're getting to that point. So we do need to rein debt in. There's no doubt about that. But then again, I heard...
Can you do it by spending more?
What you can, well, you're never going to cut your way or tax your way to prosperity. You've got to grow the economy. Okay. You've got to grow wealth, and that's what we're looking at. I heard a spokesman from Moody's, I think it was the other night, saying, well, they're not actually concerned about our credit rating as perhaps as they once were. That tells me that they think that the forecasts are, you know, maybe not going to be completely accurate, but they're not heroic either.
Larissa, let's address the question really was about the nature of politics and the fact that bipartisanship seems a very long way off, particularly on some of the key issues we're talking about now.
Well, it's funny, Brett, actually, because the big parties tend to agree on a lot of things a lot of the time, and then they have this sort of squabble in question time for the theatrics of it. Go figure, I don't know who they think that's impressing. But to your question about debt and deficit, Australia comparatively has, we're in one of the best financial positions and with one of the lowest debt ratios of the OECD comparable countries, and we've got record low interest rates. Now is the perfect time for government to be borrowing to invest in long-term infrastructure, not coal infrastructure, not $1 billion for a freebie multinational coal company to build a railway line for the world's largest coal mine, but genuinely positive and lasting infrastructure like high-speed rail, like renewable energy, like public transport, like schools, like hospitals. So I think we should in fact be borrowing more to create the jobs and stimulate positive growth that will last and not trash the place.
All right, Simon Birmingham, the question is really asking why can't the two major parties at the very least cooperate across a range of policies? What do you say to that?
Well, I think the question also went to, are we continually trying to do the same thing over again? And yet if I go back to Oliver's question at the start of the night, it was, has the government changed track and gone in a different direction?
Yep.
And the government absolutely has acknowledged that our efforts in trying to generate budget repair and bring the budget back to balance have been partly successful. Since the last election, we've seen about $25 billion worth of savings measures pass through the Senate, but they haven't been as successful as we would have liked, and that there were a number of measures that were put forward that did not have support to get through the Parliament, which is why we're taking different approach in terms of looking at elements of the revenue base, looking at the bank levy, looking at the Medicare levy, and the ways in which we can fund those types of services that Australians have said they want to see government deliver, to do so as responsibly as we can, but actually to take a different approach, an approach that in some ways, in terms of using something like the Medicare levy, as we were discussing before, is picking up on something that has been proposed by the other side of politics previously. And yes, it is disappointing that then what you get is, rather than a constructive embrace of that type of change, you end up getting more argument about trying to unpick that. I would have thought that the steps we've taken this time should have been a chance for the coming together in terms of delivering revenue to fund those services, and it's disappointing that we're not seeing that type of constructive approach.
Okay, Chris Bowen, and I'll just put to you again that the disability sector seems to have accepted that this approach from the government for getting the NDIS fully funded is appropriate.
Well, as I stress, our approach raises more money than the government. We don't accept the link to the NDIS, but it raises more money than the government's plan for the government to spend on NDIS and other things in a fairer way. But to go to your question, it's a fair one, and there's a challenge for political parties. We believe in different things. We join a political party and go into Parliament for a reason, because we on our side of politics believe in the Labor way of doing things, and Simon believes in the Liberal tradition. Now, that means we disagree about things before the Parliament, and we're a debating chamber, not an echo chamber. You don't ask us in the opposition to agree with the government all the time. That's not our role. It is our role to work with the government where we can, and we do that. Now, there are some areas where we just say, sorry, look, that is just completely against our values and our beliefs. We will oppose you all the way. There's a lot of those measures in the 2014 budget, for example, which we fought for 3 years, and finally the government's just dropped. And thank goodness we did fight them. Otherwise there'd be policy, and pensioners would be worse off today, and families on low incomes would be worse off, and unemployed people would be waiting for a new start if we'd just given the government a blank cheque. We couldn't, we shouldn't, we didn't agree with those things.
All right.
In other areas, just briefly, where we can, we do work with them. We had the first omnibus savings bill negotiated between Matthias Cormann and myself in good faith. where I said, look, there's no way we can support these things, but if you change this, we'll be able to support that. I give full credit to the government. They cooperated, and we got a good package in the end of savings, which both sides could support.
All right. I'm going to interrupt you there because we've got another question. It's about another policy you've got the chance of pushing through the Senate if you wish. It's from Leslie Rosso.
I think there's consensus amongst the general public that the big banks make too much money on the back of their customers. Malcolm Turnbull, with the backing of the ALP, has tried to appease this by introducing a levy to increase on the 4 big banks to increase revenue. But it seems likely that the banks will either increase home loans, cut their dividends, or find some way to offset this levy. Is there anything in place to stop this happening?
Okay, Simon, Birmingham, the big question, will bank customers end up paying for the levy that you impose?
Well, Leslie, they shouldn't, and we're providing around $1.2 million in additional funding to the ACCC. We're also putting in place new powers and accountability regimes around banking executives. This is a levy that largely mirrors something that applies in countries like the UK, Germany, the Netherlands. There's no reason why it can't work in Australia. There's no reason why, with banking profits sitting at around $30 billion per annum, that banks can't manage to work their way through as very large entities, only applying to the 5 largest of the banks in Australia, major banks with major liabilities who should be able to look for efficiencies across their institutions and be able to make this contribution towards the discussion we were just having before about how it is that we fund the services that Australians value, that they want, whilst still repairing the budget and getting us back to a point of health.
Okay, but the question very specifically, you said they shouldn't do it. The Prime Minister said today there's no way he can stop them from doing it. So why wouldn't they do it?
Well, Tony, we have, of course, a consumer watchdog whom we are giving additional powers to. We have and will be putting in place.
It's not illegal. It's not illegal,
regime.
and it won't be illegal for them to actually put up their charges.
Depends entirely on what the banks do and the way in which they behave, and we need to make sure they behave in a manner that is in keeping with consumer law. Now, banks, of course, ultimately are also accountable to their customers. This is a measure that only applies to the 5 largest banks with the largest liabilities in Australia. Smaller banks, other banks operating in Australia, will get a degree of competitive advantage out of this, which of course creates an opportunity for customers, if they find the big banks increase their fees, to vote with their feet and to go elsewhere and to make sure they actually put greater pressure in terms of the banking market and the tension there. These are never easy decisions as to where you raise the revenue from, whether it's a Medicare levy, whether it's a banking levy, wherever you get it from, there are always consequences you have to be mindful of. But if we want the services like the NDIS or like schools funding or like committed funding for social safety net and healthcare and Medicare, it has to be raised ultimately from somewhere. And you can't just pretend you can only pluck it from a tiny fraction of Australians. This is one, though, targeted way of getting increased revenue to fund those causes.
All right, Chris Bowen, will Labor vote this through the Senate? Because you will. Okay.
Yes. And there's an example of bipartisan cooperation, even though we wouldn't do it this way, we wouldn't design it this way. But just in terms of context, it really goes to Oliver's first question too. I know a little bit about bank levies. There's 2 treasurers who've introduced a bank levy, Scott Morrison and me, when I was treasurer. And when I introduced a bank levy, the Liberals said it would end Western civilisation and there'd be locusts and the curtains would fade. And
yours did happen to target household mortgages,
and now the government says, oh, but ours is different. Yes, it is. It's 10 times bigger. It's 10 times bigger than the levy that we brought in, which you abandoned and abolished, and now, 3 years later, are back.
Okay, but very briefly, 10 times bigger, and you're going to embrace it. Is that correct?
We're not going to argue. I'm making the point about.
I know you're trying to make a political
making
point.
a point about.
But
I'm just here with the budget. With the budget under such
we're in a
pressure.
yes or no situation.
Yes.
Okay, all right.
With the budget under such pressure,
let's move
we will
across.
support it.
Larissa Waters wants to jump in. I'll give you a chance,
Yeah.
and then we'll go to another question quickly.
Look, Leslie, great question. And I think the amount of salaries that those senior banking personnel are receiving are obscene.
Okay,
18 million.
Larissa, I'm going to pause you there because we actually have a question on this, and I'll come straight back to you. So the question is from Rob Speedy.
My question is, should the banks review their obscene salaries to their CEOs?
Yes, they should, Rob.
Before complaining about the imposition of a levy that will help the economy.
Yeah, well, can I start off?
Yeah, you can continue your...
Yes, Rob, absolutely. And the height of them to even think about passing this on to consumers when they're paying their own folk obscene amounts of money, it'd be a brave bank that tries to do that. But importantly, what we'd like to see is for it to be made easier for people to be able to switch bank accounts, because it's an awful lot of paperwork at the moment. That is one change that the Parliament could assist with by facilitating that and making it easier so that if banks do try it on and try to pass on some of that levy, then customers can more easily say, stuff you, I'm out of here to a smaller bank that doesn't fund fossil fuels.
Okay, let's hear from business. Innes, what do you think about this? There's two elements to this. One is a tax on the banks, and the other one, I call it a levy, but it's actually a tax. And the other one, it is a tax, isn't it?
It raises revenue. Call it a tax.
God, here we go
whatever.
again.
No, I said yes.
Is it a great big new tax?
Okay, so tax on the banks, and the other one is the accountability measures to look at executives' salaries and bonuses. What do you think about that as a businessman?
Well, Tony, there's a couple of points I'd like to make, and I don't represent the banks, sacre bleu. I represent industry. I'm representing people out in Western Sydney and in Brisbane who are actually making things and doing things and creating jobs, perhaps unlike others.
Yes, but there's a lot of people at the top of the businesses that you represent who might think, well, if they can do it to the banks, why can't they do it to us?
No, that's exactly where I'm going. So, on the budget night, I made 2 points. One was that as sure as night follows day, this will be passed on. It will be passed on to shareholders, it will be passed on to customers, be they households or businesses. And my fear, it's more likely to be businesses because banks can essentially hide that a bit better and not get the blowback that they would not from households. So that's going to happen. The second issue, though, is once we have done this, once we've taken this step, and I completely understand why the government has done it to raise revenue, because they do need to plug holes in the budget to fund the NDIS and the like. I completely understand that. The concern that many within industry have, and we've already heard from a minister or two about how this is the first. The concern from business is that if business and industry is successful, that they are then up for some sort of punitive levy. Now, just think of it this way. If Australia produced the next Facebook, and it was very successful, that would undoubtedly be very tempting for a government, doesn't matter which government it is, to try to put some levy on to raise revenue. I'd like a bit of that, I'll have it. That's the concern that we have and that business has. We understand where the government's coming from, and a lot of my members are no great friends of the banks. But there is a bit of head scratching going on about, well, what does all this mean? What does this mean for the business environment more generally? Does this mean that if you are successful, you in some way may be punished? And that is the concern. So if we can get from government as a first step, whichever government it is, some sort of understanding that, look, this is a one-off because banks are special. They are protected. They are a protected species. They are underwritten. The 4 pillars system basically prevents them from being competed against in a head-on way. So they have protections that other industries don't have.
So it's okay to tax them?
As I said, we understand where the government's coming from because of the special nature of that industry. But it's the flow-on that causes us some concern. When it comes to their salaries, that's a whole other
Miranda,
issue.
across the other side of the panel, wants to get in. Go ahead.
Look, economists would generally say that financial services, like mining, is in a special place in the economy and that our banks are highly protected. I don't think it's realistic to think that this is going to flow onto other sectors of the business community. I think there might be particular reasons why we want to tax our banks more. In fact, it's been very successful in the UK. People aren't really aware. They lowered their company tax rate dramatically, but they kept a levy on the banks that's raising 5 or 6 times what is proposed.
And we should do that too.
So one could possibly go that way. But the point that Innes is making about passing on to business is important, I think, because it does flow through and cascade through the economy. Our GST doesn't tax financial services enough, partly because that's a bit hard to do when you're designing a GST. But if we did levy more GST on financial services, businesses would get the credit when they use those financial services. And this bank levy, that's not going to happen. So
Okay, Simon Birmingham, just go back to the question about the obscene bonuses and salaries, which you said you're going to look at reining in through your accountability mechanism. How are you going to do that? I mean, at what point do you decide, or does this accountability regime run by APRA decide that a bonus is too big?
So APRA will, for the first time, licence banking executives, senior banking executives, and therefore have the power on a number of levels to remove a licence from a banking executive for malpractice in the sector or industry, to have provisions to be able to withhold aspects of their remuneration because of malpractice in the sector. And this is a response to the fact that from some of the scandals in the banking sector in recent years, we've seen evidence that nobody's necessarily paid the price for that. So actually putting in place stronger penalties. We've already over the years increased some of the powers for the watchdog to be able to identify and act on problems, but this is now targeting it directly at some of those who are personally responsible for conduct within their banks and within their businesses and making sure that they are accountable.
So very briefly, you'll only target obscene bonuses if there's been seen to be wrongdoing at that individual institution.
Ultimately companies are still responsible for what their executives get paid.
Right, so they can keep paying them as much as they like, as long as they don't do anything wrong.
And that's a matter for shareholders, of which pretty much everybody in this audience is superannuation holders are shareholders in Australian banks, and most viewers at home would be as well. That's a matter for shareholders and those actually running the banks as boards to make those determinations. But our accountability regime is about ensuring high standards and codes of conduct in our banks are actually met. There are penalties when they don't do so, so that rather than having simply an expensive Royal Commission, we actually have a more effective regime in place for the future.
All right, so very briefly, that's the end of your Royal Commission, isn't it? I mean,
no substitute for a Royal Commission.
No, it's not a substitute for a Royal Commission.
No, it's far better than a talk fest.
Not at all. I mean...
so you'll take the extra powers...
Actual action.
Chris, in government, you'll take the extra powers of APRA?
Yeah, we have no problem with that.
And you'll have a Royal Commission
That does not solve the systemic problem of scandals and wrongdoing in our banking and financial sector. It does not. Simon's answer just showed, frankly, how ineffective this new policy is, I think. And it's not just about the chief executive salaries, it's about remuneration across the board, it's about sending the signal to staff that they must sell products to get a decent wage, and the message that sends is just sell the product. Sell the product. Doesn't matter if the person needs it or if it's appropriate for that person. And that's been a problem for years, and the banks have ignored it. And a Royal Commission...
And that's why you need to hold somebody accountable for it.
All right.
Okay,
well, we've heard from both of you on that. Remember, you can join the discussion at Q&A Extra on Facebook Live and ABC News Radio right after this program. Now, our next question is for the Education Minister. It comes from Molly James.
Minister Birmingham, while you were at university, you were an active student politician who campaigned for fair treatment from government. You were adamant about stopping fee increases and not allowing cutbacks to be made to university funding. So why is it now, 20 years on, that your view has completely changed? Can you please justify to me why you think that the proposed changes to increase fees and lower the HECS repayment threshold is fair for university students across this country?
Okay, you want to hear the answer, I think. Thank you.
A lot's changed in the last 20, 30 years, Molly. In fact, a lot's changed just in the last decade. We've seen enormous growth in the number of Australian students going to university.
Okay. There's no point.
No, but I'll happily deal with that question as well. I'll happily deal with that question too. So
well said.
the reality
Be gentle
is...
with her. Don't drag her out.
Okay. Okay. I think you can see it's a university town. There's a good deal of passion here in the audience. But really, the question
Students
remains
have been protesting for generations.
But it is the same
It's a shame
question.
they're not being listened to.
So a few quick points. We have around 30% more students in Australian universities now than we did just a few years ago. Phenomenal growth in the numbers of Australian students going to university. That's a good thing. Our universities nowadays have the right to enrol as many students as they choose in whatever disciplines they choose. That's a good thing in terms of them being responsive to the needs in our economy and to job prospects in the future. But all of that comes at a very, very significant cost in terms of the cost of providing higher education and funding it into the future. So what have we proposed? What have we proposed that has such outrage from people they need to interrupt a program like this? What we've proposed is a 1.8% increase in fees over the next few years. A very modest increase up to 7.5%. What will that mean? That will mean that taxpayers are still providing more than half the cost of a university degree on average, 54%. But of course, taxpayers are also, for nearly everybody, paying the other 46% in what remains one of the most generous student loan schemes in the world. And our reforms are about trying to make sure that student loan scheme stays sustainable. We have about $52 billion worth of debt sitting against the student loan books, and around a quarter of that is estimated not to be repaid under current settings. So if we want to make sure that future generations of Australians can enjoy unlimited access to universities, that future generations can not have to pay $1 up front, then we need to make sure that the funding around all of that is actually sustainable into the future.
Simon, I'm just going to interrupt you for a second. We've got another question on this. Down the front, we've got a question from Beck de Graaf. Where's Beck? Please stand up. Okay.
Higher utility costs, more tax, higher housing costs, higher health costs, low wage growth and a low exchange rate. It ultimately will affect everybody. But raising the cost of a degree and lowering the wage level at which it has to be paid back is going to make the attractiveness of higher education just a little lower in a competitive world job market. As a single mum with 4 children, who I'm trying to encourage to go to uni, and also with me starting uni next year, how does this make our already becoming outdated degree seem like a great pathway?
Okay, before we go to the Minister, I want to hear from other panellists. Larissa Waters, you want to jump in?
Yeah,
Everyone
I do. Thank you.
Keep your answers brief, because we've got a few questions to go through.
Right, Tony. So Molly and Beck, thank you both for bringing that to our attention, and particularly the protesters who raised a crucial issue about the fact that there are $65 billion of corporate tax cuts. There are $24 billion of free handouts to the big mining companies, and yet they are ripping $4 billion out of universities and trying to convince us that that's a good idea. Higher education is an investment in our future. It will help all of us, and I commend you, Beck, for both aspiring for your kids to achieve that and for now going back to uni yourself. But you're right, it will make it more of a disincentive if it's going to be incredibly costly to not only afford, but then if you have to pay it back once you start earning even less than you already do. Now, we know that that will hit women more than it will hit men. So this is another attack on women by this government that doesn't really have many women in its ranks to help do a reality check on these sorts of decisions. And it presupposes that young people actually have a job in order to pay back a degree that this lot got for free. So there's just no redeeming features of this policy.
All right.
That's not
and
true,
we will
Larissa.
absolutely block it in every way.
Larissa, I want to hear from the non-politicians first, and I'll go to Ines, and then we'll hear from Miranda.
Beck, good on you. Fantastic. The issue is that our pie is just this big. Our fiscal pie is just this big. And the government, unfortunately, underlined and in bold, and can't doesn't have enough money to do all that it wants. And we all wish it would, and it could. But to get money, it needs to raise taxes, and we go back to that circular argument again.
Not corporate taxes, though, in your book, Ines.
No.
Definitely not those.
No, the reason why they don't need...
Ines, can I just bring you to the point of the question, though? I mean, what the questioner is saying is, with 4 children and a low income, a single mum is finding it hard to encourage her children to go to university. Does that worry you?
Well, it does worry me, but what worries me more is that there won't be the jobs out there for your kids at the end of university. That's what worries me more than anything else. Beyond all that they learn, all that they strive for at the end, if we're not creating a situation where companies are able to create jobs, where our kids are learning the basics, and the basics include stuff like digital technology and the like, and are then able to apply it in the real world, we won't have the jobs.
Can I interrupt? Just the logic of what you're saying. If you spend more money on education, why are there going to be fewer jobs?
Because we need to spend money in the right areas to get our people job ready. That is what the key to this is. And if we don't have people who emerge from higher education, who are able to adapt to the changing circumstances of the world, which is changing enormously around us, the skills that perhaps I learned at university don't apply anymore in this current world.
Right.
So we need to update our university and higher education.
All right, let's go to someone who actually works at a university. Miranda.
I'm the only person with skin in the game on this table. Look, from a university perspective, I guess one might say it's a slightly ungenerous budget for universities, but I don't really want to take a position on the funding specifically. On the student position, Beck, definitely encourage your kids to go to university if that's right for them. There's no doubt the empirical evidence shows that graduates do better in both jobs and wages. And one of the consequences of that does mean that most graduates can afford to pay some contribution to their higher education. They do get some personal benefit from that economic reward. Lowering that threshold does cover people on part-time wages, will affect more women. It is only 1% at that 42,000, going up gradually, so it's not overly onerous. But the biggest impediment for women in terms of earning more money at that level actually is really the cost of childcare and the structural interaction of family benefits and the personal tax rate. It's not going to be that little extra hex that
So you call a little extra hex. Obviously there's a lot of passion about it. You don't think it's too much?
Look, every dollar matters, doesn't it? So I don't want to say that for any one person it's too much. But I think statistically we can see that graduates can afford to repay. The advantage of HEX is that it is a just index, it's an interest-free loan. It does depend on your income over your life.
Chris Bowen.
Thanks, Beck, and thanks, Molly. I agree with both of you strongly. The principle that you're better off from going to university and you should pay contribution is a sound one. I was one of the first people to pay HEX. I was at university when HEX came in.
Yes, me too.
It wasn't universal. Not many of us believed in it then, but I did at the time. I thought it was appropriate. But when you're making more, $42,000 is obscenely low to require people to pay extra tax. And if you look at this budget in total, take somebody on $50,000, which is, you know, people on $50,000 are doing it tough. They have to pay $250 extra in help repayments and $1,000 extra in total. And this, with tax changes, this budget was meant to be about housing affordability. I mean, how's a young graduate meant to save for a deposit when they're paying more for their university degree, paying a Medicare levy? I mean, this government has just completely abandoned young people, frankly. Young people trying to get into the housing market, young people trying to get a university degree, utterly abandoned them. Nobody's looking out for them in this government. And this is an issue which young people have every right to be very angry about.
I'm going to come to that in a second. I just want to hear quickly from Molly, our original questioner. Stand up, Molly. You've heard the discussion going on the panel, and we're going to quickly go back to the minister. But what's your response to what you've heard on the panel?
Well, it's obviously, you know, the changes are very discouraging. Like the Shadow Treasurer said, It's very hard for young people to get ahead these days, and you know, with this budget that we've just seen, I don't think it's going to get any easier. So, not very happy about that.
Not a lot of young people in the government to shed any sort of perspective on that. So the HECS cuts, the lack of action on affordable housing, and the ignoring of climate change.
Larissa, we've got one last...
leaving a terrible legacy for future generations.
Sorry, guys. We've got time for one last question. I'm going to start with the Minister's response to it, so you can bring up the points you wanted to make there. Let's just hear from Joshua and Lucy. It's a similar question.
The ability to own a house or even rent in one of the big cities have dwindled. Penalty rates have been cut, which has a major effect on full-time students, like mentioned, and young people who are already struggling. And now a person earning $343,000 a year tells me I need to contribute more to my education financially, whilst also enduring more pain in order to receive government support from Centrelink. So my question to you is, why are you targeting my generation and our desire to, at some point, live a life that you have already been enjoying?
Simon Birmingham.
Well, to firstly go back to Beck, I would say, please don't you be discouraged, nor your children be discouraged. That, as Miranda rightly pointed out, there are real benefits that accrue from going to university, just as there are real benefits from undertaking an apprenticeship or other valid career pathways that improve employability and improve outcomes. What our changes to university fees will mean is that at the top, the change is about $17 a week in terms of the increase in fees. And if you're repaying, somebody who clicks over the new repayment threshold will pay about $8 a week in terms of their repayment rate for a graduate. And that, of course, enables us to continue to have far more people accessing higher education than has ever been the case before in Australian history.
All right. Now, to the next question, because we are short of time, and can we sort of boil down what was said? Are young people being targeted by this government? That's the essential question across a range of areas.
No.
It's housing affordability, it's penalty rates, it's university fees. These are the things nominated there.
So this budget contains a measure to help young people save for their home deposit and do so about 30% faster than might otherwise be the case. That is an important change. We're equally increasing the liquidity in terms of encouraging older people to free up land stock by being able to put some of that into superannuation, but actually selling houses that are too big for them. We're releasing Commonwealth land in terms of the supply side. These are important measures that actually can help in terms of home ownership, but ultimately, and it goes to the point that those protesting before made as well, a job is the most critical thing for people when they finish school, finish university, finish their training, whatever it is they're undertaking. And so our focus on actually growing the economy, including through measures like making our company tax regime more competitive, is about trying to make sure that there are jobs, good jobs, well-paying jobs for all Australians, so that, yes, in the future, everybody can continue to enjoy the type of strong social safety net, the type of investment in schools, the type of investment in medicare, support for a national disability insurance scheme, all of those very expensive government policies that we want as a country to have in place,
we ought to have there,
but will be funded by a growing economy and jobs in the future.
You've seen a lot of young people out in this audience and maybe out in the country shaking their heads and saying, well, that's not really answering my questions. And I'm just wondering whether you think there might be a kind of backlash from young people at some point.
Tony, we've seen university students protest at every change to HECS or the help regime ever since the moment it was introduced. Every time a government has gone near it, there have been types of protests. That's not unusual.
It's the broader question that we're talking about. But look, I'm going to throw it around to the rest of the panel because we're pretty much out of time. Chris Bowen.
Yes, young people are targeted by this government, and no question. There are real issues of intergenerational equity. Young people are being locked out of the housing market, paying more back for university, losing penalty rates. I 100% agree, and I actually agree with Larissa, young women in particular are losing big time, absolutely, and it's just got to stop. And we'll all have different ways of putting the case. We'll all have different ways of arguing it, and and from our point of view as the alternative government, we actually think that policies to give young people a chance to get in, that you don't have policy, you do not have a housing affordability package. It's a sham. It's just a complete joke what you brought down in the budget on housing affordability. You refused to use the biggest lever you have at your disposal, which is negative gearing, to put first home buyers on a more level playing field with investors. You choose investors over young people. That is your choice. It's not a choice that we make, and something we'll fix.
Okay, all right. We're pretty much out of time. I'm going to hear quickly from the other panellists. Miranda, does this ring any bells for you?
I do think we've got, not so much just in this budget, but over the last few years, we've embedded a set of measures that enable older people to accumulate wealth, and young people are bearing, I think, relatively more tax. So it would be good to see a bit more tax on capital and savings than we've currently seen. I don't think the housing policy measures, I must say, that's one bit of this budget that seems just to me to add complexity and planning opportunities for those who are well advised, and probably won't contribute very much to housing affordability at all.
Briefly, Ines.
I have 3 kids, 1 at uni, 2 in their 20s. I'd rather be 53 than 23, quite frankly. I wouldn't want to go through that again.
Because are you saying it's worse now, though? I mean, intergenerational equity was the issue.
In parts of this discussion, it is tougher. Housing affordability is a huge issue. I mean, the issue for me was when I was young was I could get a deposit up for a house and I could get started, but then I was paying 20% interest rates, which just about killed me. Now it's actually not being able to get the foot in the door. That's the big issue. So that's changed around. So housing affordability is a big issue. Where the jobs are coming from is a big issue. These are sort of real concerns that young people have, and completely justifiably so. But Tony, our young people are also our future. They're our most optimistic, forward-looking, courageous people. They do things, my kids do things that I would never dream of, and I'm immensely proud of them. And that's what gives me hope for the future, is that our young people will adapt to the changing circumstances. Yes, sure, these are tough times. We've had low wage growth for a long time, but we always find a way through, but we have to make some choices at times. Our higher education system is among the world's best. It is going to have to change.
Okay, I'm just going to quickly, we're really out of time. I'm going to come back to you. I just want to get a last word, however, from our questioner, Joshua. Do you feel like your question's been answered?
No, I honestly don't know what century you think you live in. I think you're totally out of touch, and I would really love to know how much you paid for your degree. That'd be really interesting to know, because somehow none of you own how much you earn and how much you really had to pay for the struggles that we currently are enduring. I've not seen a single politician come out during this budget time and say that their own earnings and what they are taking in by us is obscene, and that it's unrealistic to represent people like ourselves that are struggling so much.
Josh, like Chris, like most of the panel, I went through under HECS. I delivered pizzas and worked at a service station, probably like most of the panel and like many of the older audience members. Did part-time jobs to help myself through uni to be able to afford the bills and try to get ahead. Yes, it's tough today. In some ways, of course, the same debate was probably had 20 or 30 years ago as to whether it was tough then.
So, I mean, a Liberal Prime Minister once said life wasn't meant to be easy. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I think life throws up its many different challenges, but also in Australia, we have many opportunities. And the opportunity for people to go to university without paying $1 up front to pursue their dreams is something that is not afforded to many people around the world, and it's something that our policies in this budget will help to guarantee for the future.
All right. I'm being told we're completely out of time. I'm so sorry about that. Joshua, you can have one last word, 10 seconds before we go.
You're talking about, the ability to get good jobs and earn more money. What exactly do you say to the women that are earning less money than their male counterparts? Because you've got 2 sitting on your panel, and, you have not heard their story.
Okay, all right. You've taken us off in a totally different tangent, which is fair enough, but we just don't have time to discuss it. That's all we have time for tonight. Please thank our panel. Ines Willox, Larissa Waters, Simon Birmingham, Chris Bowen, Miranda Stewart, and our great audience. Give yourselves a round of applause. Briefly. Okay. Remember, you can continue the discussion on Q&A Extra with Tracy Holmes and author and satirist Ben Pobji. They're taking your comments and talk back on ABC News Radio and Facebook Live as soon as we finish. Now, next Monday, we team up with the Sydney Writers' Festival to bring you the Booker Prize-winning author of The Sellout, Paul Beattie. Journalist Nikki Sava, whose account of Tony Abbott's fall was a runaway bestseller, Will He Rise Again? Mikhail Zygar, whose latest book takes readers inside the inner circle of Vladimir Putin. Data journalist Mona Chalabi and astrophysicist Lawrence Krauss, who has modestly titled his new book, The Greatest Story Ever Told So Far. Until next week, good night.